Hello everyone and welcome back to Ushanka Show. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи! В эфире программа Ushanka Show. Today's video is a part 3 of the review of Следственное дело Куликовой Антонины. So, criminal case of Antonina Kulikova from 1948. And we need to return back to the page 1, which is постановление о принятии делу к производству. So that's the order to start processing this criminal case, because there's a small tiny detail that I missed, and that small detail is actually a big deal. If we look at the bottom of the page 1, where the signature is of the Major Udalov who ordered to start this criminal case, he made couple small corrections, and this is really important. So initial title was Следователь следодела NKGB SSSR. So investigator of the investigation department of NKGB SSSR. So this is Народный комиссариат государственной безопасности Эстонской Советской Социалистической Республики. So Major Udalov made a correction that he wasn't just their investigator, следователь, he was начальник отдела, so he was department's manager. And his second correction, and that's what actually caught my attention, he corrected that it's not NKGB anymore, it's apparently MGB. Министерство государственной безопасности. So I looked it up, and sure enough, back in March 22nd, 1946, so 2 years prior, NKGB was renamed into MGB. So it's not commissariat anymore, it's ministry now, министерство. So this criminal case is actually kind of like a wild mix of old style and new style paperwork, because even the cover says still Народный комиссариат государственной безопасности НКГБ, and some paperwork inside called it already Министерство государственной безопасности МГБ. And I don't know if this lady actually had a good lawyer. Was it possible for her to defend herself? Because, you know, I'm not sure which organization is actually charging me with the crime. Is it NKGB or MGB? I don't know, but it's definitely they didn't care. They just utilized old paperwork, and then they had some new one. But it's only in this spot on page 1 that Major Udalov bothered to correct that he is not NKGB, he is actually MGB. So why was it a big deal? In 1948, still during the Stalin era, Soviet government finally abandoned its revolutionary terminology and accepted old-fashioned terminology. So commissariat became ministry. Министерство. So after October Revolution of 1917, the Soviet government, so that's Vladimir Lenin and company, made the decision to get rid of all the old-fashioned capitalist terminology. So they won't have ministers, they won't have officers in the army, and so on. So the word commissariat and commissar was, I could say, invented or borrowed from French. So for a while, we didn't have ministers in the Soviet Union. We had commissars. There was a commissar of heavy industry, commissar of foreign relations, and so on. There was no ministries and no ministers. Similarly, there were no officers in Red Army. They just called them командиры, commanders. So if you command a battalion, you're комбат, commander of battalion. If you command army, you're командарм, commander of army. Similarly, brigade, комбриг. So that was just like a title with no actual officer. There was no majors or colonels, nothing like that, no generals, just commanders. And only in 1935, Red Army reintroduced officers' titles. So they got lieutenants, senior lieutenants, captains, majors, and so on. But still they had комбриги and комдивы and командармы, no generals. And on May 7, 1940, в целях поднятия авторитета высшего командного состава. So in order to raise the authority of higher command, the general title was introduced. So it took Soviet Union, the very first socialist state, about 30 years to do complete circle and return back to have their own generals and their own ministers. And we also need to talk about NKGB. It's very, very important. So Народный комиссариат государственной безопасности, People's Commissariat of State Security. But most people are familiar with NKVD, Народный комиссариат внутренних дел, so that's a People's Commissariat of Inner Affairs. So suddenly we have two different organizations. Both are commissariats, one of state security and another one of inner affairs. So what's the difference? Well, NKGB is actually a baby brother of NKVD, and it has a quite interesting history. And I said baby brother because originally there was only one NKVD, but in February of 1941, about 5 months before Hitler attacked Soviet Union, NKVD was split in two organizations, NKVD and NKGB. So now we have Commissariat for State Security and Commissariat for Inner Affairs. What's quite curious is that Soviet sources as well as the modern Russian sources are very silent about the reasons why that split occurred. I mean, Stalin needed suddenly two organizations in February of 1941. But what is even more interesting, NKGB existed as a separate commissariat for hardly 6 months. In July of 1941, so after Hitler attacked Soviet Union on June 22nd, suddenly there was no reason anymore to keep two organizations, and NKGB disappeared. It remained only NKVD. So whatever the reason in February 1941 existed, in July 1941 there was no more reason to keep NKGB separately. But then guess what? In April of 1943, NKGB, just like Phoenix, rised again, and NKVD was split in two organizations once again. So they did it in February of 1941, canceled that decision in July of 1941, and suddenly 2 years later, in April of 1943, Stalin decided he needs again NKGB and NKVD. But I found an explanation why NKGB, like a phoenix from ashes, reappeared in April of 1943. And out of all the places, the explanation was right in the open on official Russian site Historia.rf, and it says that in 2 years after Red Army began its unstoppable movement westward, there was a question who would provide state security on the deoccupied territories of the Soviet Union as well as Eastern European countries. Which begs one simple question. If you guys recreated NKGB in April of 1943 with the sole purpose of providing security on the newly deoccupied Soviet territories as well as the Eastern European countries, was that the same reason you created NKGB back in February 1941, but someone, Hitler crushed your plans, and then you had to cancel those plans in July of 1941 and take apart NKGB for a while. Okay, my friends, it's all I have for you today. I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. What do you think about why Stalin created NKGB in February of 1941, disassembled it in July 1941, then recreated again in April 1943? I'm very curious, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.